All right, is this thing working? Okay. Well, thanks everybody for coming for this lunch event with Dr. Mark Mitchell and the American Conservative. So before we get started, I just want to introduce the American Conservative very quickly. You may be familiar, but it's my obligation as an employee of the American Conservative to tell you about it and encourage you to go to our site and subscribe. So the American Conservative has been around for 20 years. 20 years in 2000, last year, started in 2002, and is dedicated to what we call Main Street conservatism. It's a conservatism that stands against the unchecked power in both government and big business, and stands up for the small town America. So, and then on that note, that is, sorry, I wish I had a table here. That would be helpful. At any rate, on that note, it's very topical for our discussion today on plutocratic socialism. So let me introduce Dr. Mark Mitchell. Mark T. Mitchell is, tell me if this is all correct, I pulled it off your website. So, Dean of Academic Affairs, Chairman of the Department of Applied Liberal Arts, and Professor of Government at Patrick Henry College. He is the author of several books, including Power and Purity, The Unholy Marriage That Spawned America's Social Justice Warriors, and The Limits of Liberalism, Tradition, Individualism, and the Crisis of Freedom. He holds a PhD in government from Georgetown University. All sound right? All right. So, by the way, you can grab our recent issue of our magazine on the back table there. There we take on the Ukraine issue on the top story. So this is the book, Plutocratic Socialism, The Future of Private Property and the Fate of the Middle Class. If you haven't gotten it yet, you can do so. You can get it on Amazon, though I don't, in the spirit of the book, I don't recommend it. Where else can you get it? Can you? At
a local bookstore near you.
There you go, local bookstore near you. Or maybe from the publisher directly, I suppose, if you want to go online. But at any rate, very thought-provoking book. So let me just start by asking this. At first glance, plutocracy and socialism seem to be opposites. Plutocracy, of course, being from the Greek, plutos meaning money, and kratos meaning power, so rule of money or the moneyed elite. Socialism, of course, purports to overturn that sort of power structure and to implement something like the rule of the proletariat or what have you. But your title, you suggest that they're actually related and even modify socialism with plutocracy. Maybe they're suggesting they're two sides of the same coin or something like that. So I'm wondering if you could sort of help explain the title of the book and maybe with that give a brief overview of the argument in the book.
Well, thank you, Sean, and thank you to TAC for putting this together, and thank you all for coming. The title is intended to be a little bit provocative, and it is. It seems like it's a marriage of two things that shouldn't be together, don't make sense together initially. But if you think about where we are as a country, where increasingly we have a kind of shrinking middle class, this has been pointed out for some years now, and you have a class of individuals who are increasingly consolidating power, and you see this at the public level with this expansion of government, also in the private with the just expanding of concentrations of capital. And what's happening is as that class of wealthy individuals and corporations and consolidations of money and influence at the public level, it creates a kind of vacuum. The middle class becomes increasingly thin, evacuated, and what you have is a class of individuals who are bereft of capital, who have an increasing sense of despondency, despair, and a kind of helplessness. And that's a perfect recipe for creating the conditions that Marx talked about. Marx said something really suggestive. He said, the first step in the communist revolution was to win the battle of democracy. Well, how do you win the battle of democracy? You do it through the ballot box. You need, in Marxist terms, to have a majority of proletarianized citizens. When you have a majority of proletarianized citizens, you have citizens who are going to see a kind of unjust, from their perspective, allocation of resources and capital, and they're going to use the ballot box to redistribute that and access that capital, which is to say there's going to be a kind of democratic means by which the revolution, the reallocation of capital occurs. Well, those on top aren't going to be happy with that. They're not going to be satisfied with that. They're not going to relinquish their positions. And this is why, incidentally, socialist movements, they always get stuck, right? You have this kind of wonderful forward vision of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and the state will wither away. It never happens. You always have a class of wealthy, powerful individuals who are in place and end up placating the disgruntled proletarian class. And what I'm suggesting is that there's a kind of symbiotic relationship between a plutocratic class that holds the capital and holds the reins of power, if you will, because property and power go together, and this is a really important point. They've always gone hand in hand. And you have a class that has property, power, and influence and status and wants to hang on to it, but they also recognize there's a bubbling, disgruntled, and expanding class of propertyless individuals who think that the game is rigged, who think that something's wrong. So what does the plutocratic class have to do? They have to placate the proletarian class, if you will, with policies and goodies and materials that satisfy enough to keep the revolution from tipping all the way over, but not so much that you disrupt the property allocations that keep the plutocratic class in place. And so you have a kind of symbiotic relationship. Both need the other. The plutocratic class needs the underclass to exist so that they can exercise a kind of virtue in giving to the classes that are in need, that they can placate their sense of the entitlement they have, the wealth they have, by giving, by providing policies and that give the underclass something that make them clients. And so there's a client relationship here that just is perpetuated by a two-tiered system. And what's missing and what is so vital, and this brings it back to the American system, what's missing is a robust and stable middle class that provides the means by which our constitutional order can survive. The American revolutionary movement and moment assumed and was built upon a society of private property owners. And they were concerned about power. Everyone that at the time of the American founding worried about power. And what they understood is that power and property go hand in hand. And it's only a system of individuals that are broadly propertied that is going to provide the undergirding for our constitutional order. Without propertied citizens, our constitutional order it just doesn't fit. It's not built for that. So that's kind of the rough outline of the thesis.
Good, thank you. Yeah, that's really really helpful. Very interesting. You suggest, and I think we got a little bit of it here, but you say at one point in the book that you are not approaching private property from an economic perspective, but from a political perspective. I think we sort of got a taste of what you meant by that. But can you expand on that?
Yeah, if from an economist perspective, you think in terms of GDP, growth, supply and demand, and so on. What I'm interested in is what I suggested earlier, is the political connection with property. Property and power go hand in hand, and therefore I'm concerned about questions of power, of separations of power or allocations of power, of questions of freedom ultimately. And these political questions are inseparable from questions about property. You can't separate those two. And I think sometimes we lose sight of. We think freedom is something that is a kind of inner impulse, and it's an absence of external constraint. But an effective freedom always has a kind of means by which it can be exercised, and historically, that's always property.
Yeah, good. So you also say private property and political freedom stand or fall together. So you just touched on this question of freedom. But it seems like the common way that we talk about freedom in modern America, and not just America, but sort of in the West, at least, is not the same thing, perhaps, as what you're suggesting. So I wonder if you could, what do you mean by freedom and political freedom in particular?
Yeah, well, this is important, and there's a long discussion to be had here. But what we have today in our society primarily is a conception of freedom that's held broadly that sees any constraint that is not voluntarily invented or submitted to as an imposition on my freedom. And therefore, any kind of law that's not consented to is an imposition of my freedom. But this is expanded in ways that are kind of surprising from the perspective of a kind of classical liberal school that brought this into being, such that you can think of, say, in the 17th century, a kind of impulse to reject the authority of tradition was something that emerged. And so tradition is a kind of imposition or a pressure that is unjust if I don't invent it or if I haven't consented to it. We see, as I say, in the 19th century, a kind of recognition that, well, the existence of God is a kind of imposition on me. I haven't consented to that, so we can kill God. That, again, expands the purview of our freedom. And what we're seeing now, interestingly enough, is something that could never have been imagined 200 years ago or even 100 years ago, is an attempt to overthrow or discard even the limitations of biology itself. Because biology is seen as a kind of imposition. I didn't choose it, and therefore it needs to be made optional. And so we have these kind of overthrows of impositions that were seen as providing a context within which human beings could flourish. And with this, we have a new conception of freedom that is always freedom from. It's always escape. It's always release. It's interesting. Think of this in literary terms. That sort of the dawn of Western civilization, you have Homer's Odyssey. And Homer's Odyssey is all about Odysseus trying to get home, because his life only has a kind of coherent meaning when he is at home in Ithaca, in the house that he built with his wife, with his son, and this is the whole orientation of his life. Apparently, when he was writing Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain was reading the Odyssey. And what you have is a kind of inversion of the Odyssey in Huckleberry Finn. A kind of American inversion, if you will. Because what is Huckleberry Finn trying to do? He's trying to escape home. He's trying to escape the constraints of civilization, of home, of all the regularizing limits that make a life meaningful. And he's going to get on the water, right? But unlike Odysseus, who's trying to use the water as a means to return home, Huckleberry Finn's using it as a means to escape. And you have some episodic adventures on the shore as you go through the story, just like in the Odyssey, but it's always about release, escape. And this more typifies, I think, a modern mind, our modern American mind. And one of the things that property does, real property, is it grounds you somewhere. It places you somewhere. It limits you. But only in that limitation does one find the opportunity to flourish in a community of other human beings in a way that is properly human. So we've got some different conceptions of freedom. And freedom, I think, just to put it in very succinct terms, always has to include an acknowledgement of and a willingness to live within limits.
Yeah, I think limits, that's a really important word here, really important concept that seems to be being lost in some sense. And it seems like constitutional order itself requires limits, right? Because it requires us to live within a particular sort of framework. But I wonder, and maybe this is controversial, but to sort of bring it up to our current debates on the right in particular, I'll ask about two things. One is about our politics, and one is about our economic debates. First, so the founding is sometimes argued to have been modern, right, and liberal in some sense. How should we think about the Constitution in light of that fact that it's in some ways related to and comes out of these 18th century, well, 17th and 18th century developments and the kind of freedom that exists there. And then the second thing is, on the right, there's our debates between sort of both a kind of libertarian globalism and also a libertarian sort of domestic economic structure. And lately, right, a kind of economic nationalism. It seems like your book challenges perhaps both of those. Is that right? Or where would you situate your books? That's kind of two questions, but both related to the kind of current debates on the right.
The constitutional question is, you can think of someone like Patrick Deneen's book, right? That the Constitution is simply a product of a liberal order, and therefore the failure of liberalism equals the failure of the constitutional order, and so on. I think it's more complicated than that, which is to say, the American founders, first of all, are not philosophers. Thank the Lord. Right, they were practical statesmen, and they're picking and choosing, and they're borrowing from a wide array of resources as they put together a mechanism by which they thought the American people could be governed, and to be sure, there are some liberal elements there, but what I think is really important, and this is something Robert Nisbet points out, is that someone like Jefferson could talk all about these kind of abstract liberties and rights and so on, but what he was speaking out of was a cultural consensus that was deeply informed by pre-liberal categories. And so the language and the vocabulary was overlaid something much deeper and thicker that would serve to moderate and temper that language and direct that language. And now the question becomes, what happens to that language of liberalism once that deep and thick soil of a kind of pre-liberal consensus has largely eroded? It's going to look different, it's going to sound different, it's going to behave differently and bring about different outcomes. And so this is the same distinction that someone like Russell Kirk makes when he speaks of an unwritten constitution. You've heard that term? It's a really important term. That every society says it has a written constitution, also has an unwritten constitution. And ideally, the written constitution emerges out of the resources of an unwritten constitution, that they're related in a coherent way. But it raises an important question. that what happens when the written Constitution persists over some time, and the unwritten Constitution that gave it life, that gave it birth, changes. You've got a fundamental tension that's very difficult to navigate. And I think one of the truths that we just really need to take to heart and recognize is unwritten constitutions always win. And so you'll have a written constitution that may persist, but if the unwritten constitution changes, the written constitution will either be ignored or its meaning will have to be altered. We'll have to interpret it differently for a different time. Unwritten constitutions is the driving force of a society. The economic question then is between a kind of libertarian globalized economic vision and a more nationalized one. Well, if those are the only two choices, and I hope they're not, I guess I'd go with the national, because the kind of international globalized system creates and brings forth a kind of apparatuses of power that aren't susceptible to national limits, and therefore are really not susceptible to any limits. And a national kind of economic vision at least has a kind of parameters that are framed by the nation. But I would maybe suggest that could we come up with a third option? I'll avoid saying third way since that's overused. But it's just a third option. Why not? Why stop at the nation? Why not think more specifically and concretely in terms of regional and local resources and categories and economies? You think of how the ideal of, and people, it's hard to find, but if you say you're going to go to Lowe's to buy a tool, committed. I'm going to buy it made in America. First of all, you're going to be hard pressed to find a hammer that's not made in China, but maybe you do, or maybe you go to a local hardware store and you find something that's made in America, and that's in a way well and good. But would it make a difference in terms of how we think about economies and how we think about even ourselves and our relationship to our particular places if there was a hammer that said made in Indiana? Or made in Burlington, Vermont? I mean, does that change the way we think about production, the way we think about belonging, the way we think about coherent communities of meaning that would in fact serve to ground us psychologically and culturally in a more specific place? Because one of the things that constitutes and really shapes our world today is a kind of free-floating, wandering potentiality, right? It's one of the harmful things parents do to kids. Lots of parents do mostly good things to kids, I hope. But one of the things that's it's just not a good thing to do to a kid is tell them, Jimmy, you can be anything you want to be. Because first of all, that's not true. And second of all, it's just bad. Well, it's bad theology. We're called to certain things. We're shaped to do certain things. We have certain skills and abilities. And so it's not what Jimmy wants to do. The question is, Jimmy, what have you been made to do? Right? And suddenly Jimmy then is not thinking about being this free-floating individual that just that just floats above the world as a kind of chooser, free-floating chooser, but he thinks, okay, where is my place? Where am I suited to be? Where am I suited even perhaps to serve? Well, that's a different way of thinking, and that's a different way of helping to shape Jimmy. And this idea that human beings are these free-floating, sort of unattached individuals looking to attach ourselves in ways that we decide, ultimately, all about consent, and there's no other constraints, there's no other limits, is really a lie. I mean, think about it in just the most basic terms. None of us chose our parents. You mean the thing that maybe shapes us more than anything else is something that's before and prior to our choosing? Yeah. And that's how so much of our life is. It's not something to chafe against, but something to recognize as a proper limit And limits, you think of limits as guardrails too. Limits don't just keep us down, they also direct us to where we ought to be. And this idea that freedom is really just a kind of explosion of constraints is a false ideal that will very easily lead us wrong. That we, and I think those of us who are a little older recognize that the best things in life come only in the wake of commitments, lifelong commitments, absolute commitments, where you say, this is where I'm going to be, these are the people I'm committed to, this is the person I'm going to marry, and I'm here, and this is where I'm going to be, this is where I'm going to make a life. And it's that kind of disposition that is not characterized by a kind of insistence upon my absolute liberation that that provides the context by which we can live a good life. That's a long, answer to an economic question that turned.
No, I think that's all relevant. I think because without being Marxist, it's certainly true that our material conditions do, kind of constrain us, guide us, direct us, form us in some ways. And I think that's in some ways also part of the argument of the book, right? That property, right, and economic arrangements do actually impact that. And what you say is woke socialism gives us, in the term you use is liberated Gnostic nomad as a new kind of citizen. Interesting neologism there. Could you explain that and maybe how exactly, say a little more about how property gives us that specific, or the arrangement of property gives us that specific citizen type?
Yeah. Well, liberated Gnostic nomad, I've already kind of touched on some of these themes, so I think it probably sounds not as surprising as if you just pop that off at the beginning. But liberated in the sense of I have eliminated, or I conceive of myself as liberated from all constraints. Gnostic is really just a kind of reinvigoration of an ancient heresy that sees the body as merely something to be dispensed with, or to simply be used as an instrument, rather than something essential to who I am. And you can think of how the new Gnosticism is emerging in so many different ways, or the way that we interface with technology is a kind of validation of a sort of Gnosticism that we can imagine, and there are people talking about this, that we can imagine living forever by means of having our consciousness uploaded onto the cloud, leaving bodies behind. Now, if you all have read C.S. Lewis's novel from the 1950s, That Hideous Strength, if you haven't read it, you should, because I just reread it. It's a remarkably prescient book, and what the villains in this novel are trying to do by means of science and technology is escape bodily existence. It's a dream, right? It's a dream that ultimately is hostile to what it means to be human. And just even think of this in terms of Ash Wednesday that's being observed not just by Catholics today, is that I'll go get some ashes later today. Is that it's what's being undermined and subtly critiqued and denigrated is the incarnation. That bodily existence is something that is something to be escaped. It's undesirable. And so we've got a liberated Gnostic nomad as this kind of free-floating individual that sees himself or herself as merely an agent of choice. Bodies are merely optional, right? And certainly our biology can be manipulated at will. Transhumanism is just one step on a trajectory to transgenderism is just a step in the trajectory to transhumanism. It's all of a piece, and it is well with us right now. And it's in the air, and there is a very strong momentum in this direction to eradicate any notion of kind of biological essentialism, if you will. Male, female, all of these things are under fire. And they're under fire because they're seen as impositions. They're seen as limits on our freedom. And so the liberated Gnostic nomad is a kind of person that wants to be sprung out of, if you will, the confines of humanness, which is to say it is ultimately anti-human. And that should bring us pause, right? And property as a kind of mechanism, think private property, real private property limits us. You think of historically, a piece of land, you cultivate a piece of land where it is. You can't take it and move it around. And owning, say, the tools of a trade, you have to engage physically with the world in a particular way that's suited to the material upon which you're working. But I think there's an obvious rejoinder or critique, criticism, say, hold on. This is some kind of a nostalgic look back to a kind of agrarian society that did exist at the time of the American founding, but doesn't exist now. It's fair enough. And that raises a really important question. How do we conceive of property in the 21st century in such a way that the virtues that property cultivates, the limits that private property, real private property, helps to facilitate? How do we conceive of property in such a way that we can benefit from property without moving back to the farm? Now, I'm not saying moving back to the farm is a bad thing. Maybe Sean will do that someday. He's got a family farm. But is it possible to bridge this gap? To conceive of property in a way that doesn't require a kind of a return to an agrarian society, because that's not in the cards. But there's a couple problems, and one is this. Many people today don't want to own property, have no desire to. And this is a little surprising to some of us older people. Well, what the sort of brass ring is if I can own my own house and maybe a little yard, and I can grow some potatoes and I can have a dog and some kids and a wife, and those are things that are really good. What happens when you have a generation of young people who have no aspiration to settle down, to commit, or to own? So it's not just private property that becomes the issue. It becomes cultivating a desire, a shifting of desires, such that ownership becomes an ideal. But ownership's a problem, as I said, because I'm not talking about everybody needs to own land or 40 acres and a mule or anything like that. And I think a way to navigate this is to reconceive the way we think about property. That we've come, there's one way to think about it. I mean, you think of property as something that's in absolute terms. This is something that I own, and I can do whatever I want with it because it's mine. And so I can break it, I can cultivate it, I can sell it, I can keep it, I can give it away, whatever. It's mine absolutely. But I think there's another alternative that splits, that really comes up with, again, a third alternative to absolute ownership and a kind of dispensing of private property for kind of communal ownership. And that is this idea of stewardship. And I talk about this a lot in the book because I think at heart this is the key. And stewardship obviously is a kind of a theological term ultimately. Because a steward is one who cares for something at the behest of an authority. You're given something by someone to care for that person. It's a kind of vice regency, if you will. And so if we think of ourselves as stewards, say stewards of the natural world, well, the obvious question is, well, who are you stewarding it for? And we might say for future generations. We could be good Burkeans at that moment, right? But ultimately, I think there's a kind of theological move here that makes stewardship coherent. And that is all of us find ourselves responsible for certain people, places, and things. And we do this as a way of exercising a proper responsibility to God. Now, if we think in those terms, suddenly the necessity for real property isn't as acute. That yes, we could think of a piece of land as something that I steward for not just myself, but for future generations not yet even born. Sean is and his wife are repairing a historic home in Delaware.
Correct.
And they're thinking about not just their own enjoyment, but how do you preserve this home for people that you'll never even meet, that you'll never live to see? Now, if we're thinking in those terms, suddenly we can get beyond real property. We can think about cultural gifts, for instance. What a constitutional order. A constitutional order that we have inherited, that we have been gifted with, and have a kind of responsibility to care for so that we can pass it on to future generations. That's a kind of stewardship. And you can think of even your bodies, right? Our bodies are something that we have, but it's this absolute ownership that would entice us to think that we can do anything with our bodies that we want, rather than thinking, well, what are bodies for? What are human beings for? And living and shaping our lives in such a way that we are using our bodies in a way that is honoring to our bodies and ultimately honoring to God. And so you can see that once we introduce this idea of stewardship, the ripple effects go out beyond simply real property to include things like cultural inheritances, our constitutional order, stories that you inherit from your parents, your grandparents. There's an obligation. Tell the stories. Repeat the stories so that future generations have them. And so ultimately what I'm suggesting is that we see the world differently when we recognize that everything we possess is a gift. We are recipients of gifts. We are recipients of gifts with a kind of obligation to tend those gifts well, so that, not that we can extract and use them up and discard them, but so that we can cultivate, improve, and then pass them on when our time comes, when the next generation is in place to receive those. Culture ultimately only exists in this kind of fashion of grateful reception, careful tending, and then loving transmission. And when we think of stewardship in that way, I think the requirement for real property suddenly expands. But real property can help us cultivate a disposition of stewardship. It can help us cultivate that desire and that disposition that extends beyond real property.
Great, yeah. And that certainly pushes back against what Pope Francis has called the throwaway culture. You know, we need durable goods. We need things that we can actually hand down. It's not, everything cannot just be constantly disposable. Yeah. Good stuff. Well, let's turn over to the audience. Anybody have any questions? We've said a lot here, so feel free to ask a question about any or all of it. Tom. Oh, wait for the microphone, please.
In the conservative sphere, there's a big debate in family policy, which seems to be stuck on tax credits, child tax credits, subsidy with or without work and everything. My impression is that this is just kind of crumbs for the proletariat, and it doesn't get to the really freeing the family from some of the obstacles that they confront. Can you mention anything about that? Have you thought about that?
Well, there's some general sort of policy directions I think my argument indicates, and this would have implications for family policy, obviously. And one is this: just as policymakers are thinking about and crafting policy, I think a question that just has to be front and center all the time is: does this help or harm the middle class? And if it helps to strengthen and expand the middle class, then I say that's a good thing. And if it is merely a kind of a guilt payment, crumbs from the table, you say, in order to maintain a kind of status quo of dependency, this is it's devastating. I mean, it's harmful socially, but it's also harmful psychologically and sociologically. There's an example. There's an organization out in Northern Virginia that helps single mothers, and one of the things they do is they take goods from people who just give material stuff that could be used by single mothers in a home. And they have a whole kind of store that they call it. But what they don't do is just allow people to come in and take stuff. They have training, and that they provide the schooling classes and so on. And when people take those classes, they essentially gain money, the equivalent of money, to go in and take stuff from the store. What that does is just a remarkable. It's remarkable because the people understand that they're not getting something for free. People don't want handouts. People want to be able to provide for their families. And this is why I have a chapter in my book on work. And I think something that is so important is that we are fostering economic systems that encourage and really require work and connect work with property. That people want to work to provide for themselves. And what you do when you're just constantly sort of dribbling out the crumbs, as you say, is you're creating resentments. And you're creating a kind of disposition of dependence that's not helpful at all. It's not cultivating kind of virtues that are necessary for citizens to be restrained. And when you have circumstance tax policy, for instance, that alleviates a tax burden to a whole swath of people, well, you don't have to pay taxes. It's a very dangerous situation. Tocqueville understood this. That one of the most dangerous kind of moments in a democracy is when you have universal suffrage and you have people without property who can vote. He says that in a democracy, it's the only system where people can vote to raise taxes on everyone but themselves. And he says that you can conceive of a tax structure in three different ways. That if you have a large class, so say proletarianized citizens who can vote, they're going to vote very rationally to raise taxes on people, not them, in order to redistribute goods and services to them. Perfectly rational. But it undermines the connection between work and property and creates resentments in between classes. There's another way, Tocqueville says, when you have a middle class that really characterizes the disposition of a society. He says nothing is he says that middle class folks are allergic to taxation, basically, because nothing harms a small fortune like even a small tax. So the most restrained tax policy is going to be that is provided by and supported by a strong middle class. And so again, in terms of family policy, you want families who have property. The question isn't how do you give them some stuff, but how do you help them move to the middle class? And if you have a gap between the dependent class and the middle class that is seen as an unbridgeable gap. You could just, those of you who read, say, J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, that's exactly what he's talking about, a kind of generational despair. And there's no way out, because what you don't see in these communities is examples of people moving from dependent to middle class. And part of this is because people like Sean leave their hometowns. I did too. And this idea of meritocracy that sort of draws everybody, the most talented, to a few super zips, as Charles Murray called them. It evacuates talent from everywhere else. And what it does is evacuates and limits the possibility of models of success in a particular place. So here's how you do it. Here's how you move into the middle class. And what people need more than help is models. You need to see examples, because it's the imagination that's triggered by examples. And if you see nobody making that move, the imagination isn't triggered, and you just don't have there's no wherewithal, no possibility to make that move, or it's very difficult. So tax policy that creates opportunities for people to make that move, to become owners, I think is absolutely essential. And that's going to have bearing on families in really important ways.
So that's interesting, actually. Is you would think, or the argument might be, if you see people moving up past you, that's what breeds resentment. But you're saying that resentment is actually when there's no movement, and that it sort of comes from a disembodied handout or something like that.
Disembodied handout. And Tocqueville, again, says that the vice that is most specific to a democratic age is envy. And this is something to really pay attention to, right? Because envy can tear things apart. And it's not, and this is, I'm not making an appeal at all for a kind of equalization of property ownership. What I am suggesting is that a healthy America is going to be characterized when a critical mass of citizens, a majority, see themselves as property owners, are property owners, or aspire to be property owners and see a way to get there. Because people who do not yet own property, don't own capital, but know that that's where they're going to go. They're going to work hard, and there's a means to make that jump. They're going to vote like property owners because they're thinking of their future selves. I want this system to be in place so that when I get there, my property is going to be intact and protected and not threatened by government intrusion. And so property owners and aspiring property owners are really important.
Yeah, I remember, it reminds me of a quip someone said once, I think, the reason why socialism never took in America is because it's full of temporarily embarrassed millionaires. Is there one more question?
Can you talk a little bit about how, like, what forces were at play for this consolidation of property into plutocratic hands? And how do we kind of find our way out of this mess? My understanding is, like, the libertarian impulse assumes an unlimited supply of property, and kind of the Main Street family is left to fight against the capitalist or the BlackRocks. And I don't really see many tools available other than government regulation by a government that doesn't have that interest. So can you speak to those forces and the...
Well, you're pushing on a really difficult question, right? Is how where did this come from, you asked, and then how do you get out of it? First of all, where did it come from? I think that in the last few decades, the left and the right have sort of been fighting against, you can think of how say the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street Party, right? The problem is big government, says the Tea Party, and Occupy Wall Street, no, the problem is big business. And they just go back and forth. And I think the problem is big. Concentrations of power, whether it's political or economic, are always dangerous. And this is exactly what the American founders were worried about. Concentrations of power. How do you avoid this? How do we, because here's the thing. You cannot, you can't have a political system or an economic system without some concentration of power. That's just what's necessary. But then the question is, how do you have enough in order to accomplish what you want, but not concentrated so much that you create a monster. And this is really the debates around the Constitution are just this: is this enough power? Too much power? Alexander Hamilton says this plan gives us the least energetic government that's necessary in order to protect our liberties. And some of the anti-federalists are like, no, this is way too powerful. You're creating a monster here. But both of them are just asking this question about power. Something that Robert Nisbet points out, but also a kind of lefty economic historian like Carl Polanyi points out, that big business, big government, they emerge at the same time. And they grow and they facilitate the growth of each other. They feed off of each other and depend on each other. All right, so that's an important thing that to recognize. And then this question of how do you fix it? Because one of the things that someone like Hilary Belloc, the distributist guy from the early 20th century, said in his book Restoration of Property, said, big government has gotten us into this mess, and we need to harness the power of big government to get us out. Now that worries me. Because it's almost as if saying, well, big government, big is a problem, and we need, but we can handle the temptation of power well, right? We can handle the ring. Give me the ring, I will make everything better. And as soon as you start thinking about power in those terms, I think you're falling to the seduction that is so perennial for human beings. And so I think we need to be very careful and be very thoughtful about how to get this. And again, I don't have a policy program, but we need to think about how do we eliminate barriers to entry? How do we make it possible for people to start their own businesses, make it easy to start their own businesses? How do we eliminate regulatory capture? Crony capitalism is really just the flip side of what I'm calling plutocratic socialism. It's just, they go hand in hand. And this idea of cronyism that makes it possible for individuals and corporations to harness the favor of state and national government is a problem. How do you create a wall of separation, to coin or to steal a Jefferson term from another context, between those two? I think this is an important question. We need to think very seriously about how to do it, and be very careful about simply being in a cavalier fashion saying what we just need to do is grab the power so that we can limit the power. Dangerous.
I think we got time for one more. We got one more.
Thank you for your talk. It's been very informative. Definitely going to buy the book. So got $20 out of this. Anyways, I guess, so background for me, I work in corporate America. I've really benefited from the work from home and flex our stuff that we have. My wife and I were able to move out to Manassas, Virginia, get a house that would have cost, a condo around here. Been able to get to know our neighbors. We have a nice downtown of good character. So I see a lot of benefits of the work from home trend, if it persists, to actually bring people further out of the super zips and into communities, maybe not their own original community, but at least communities that have a bit more character. I'm wondering, do you see that same thing in your analysis, that would be a step in the right direction? Or do you think some of the challenges of, not really knowing your coworkers because you're never going in, or you're still working for, like, in my case, corporate America, do you see that still being a fix, or do you think it's not really going to solve the underlying issues here?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think a lot of these fixes are going to be partial and tenuous, and there'll be some good parts and bad parts. But think about the return of a kind of productive activity to the home. I mean, returning to the family farm does that, but in a way, so too does working from home. Homeschooling is a kind of returning of productive activity to the home that is a kind of interesting thing that's happened in the last 20 or 30 years. And so I think there's a double-edged sword here, because as you say, there's still the basic structure of centralization of corporate America still exists, but bringing people into an orbit where they're participating more fully with the life of their family and their communities. Anything you do to promote that, I'd say, is a good thing. Certainly, the whole COVID experience of the last couple of years did send people back either to their homes for better or worse, right? Some people were just going stir crazy in the home. Some people thought this is great. But one thing, and this is sort of a bigger question, and it really is something to keep an eye on, because the way that the dynamics that I'm describing are perpetuated is almost invariably through the language of crisis. That is, the power holders secure and maintain and expand their power in the name of crisis. And crisis always is about security, right? And so, I mean, whether or not, whatever you think about the COVID thing, it did have a remarkable, it was a remarkable opportunity for the expansion of power. And now that that's dissipated, what we're hearing now, and it's going to ramp up, is the whole climate thing. Is just going to be a means. And I'm not making any statement one way or the other. I really don't know about the climate science, but it's used politically to expand power and to secure power. And it's really interesting to think about going back even to FDR. Remember those during the dark days of the Depression and World War II, FDR does the fireside chats, and he talks about the four freedoms. Some of you have seen him. Norman Rockwell makes his paintings, the four freedoms. There's something charming and wonderful about them, but there's also something ominous. And there's a shift, there's a sleight of hand. Because he speaks of freedom of speech, freedom of worship. Those are right up with that's quintessentially American. Do you remember what the other two are? Freedom from want and freedom from fear. And the government is going to provide freedom from want. I don't know about you, but my wants, when they're sort of unleashed, are endless. Freedom from fear, that's a psychological condition that is never alleviated if we make that our priority. And so by a kind of subtle sleight of hand, FDR introduces a kind of purpose for the government that opens up limitless opportunities for the expansion of power. It's been going on for a long time. Crisis, the language of crisis, the language of security, these are the means by which power is held, secured, and expanded. And just pay attention when someone talks about crisis. Some crises are real, and discernment is needed. But some are, even if they're real, are used for political purposes. That's something we have to pay attention to and inoculate ourselves against.
All right. Well, thanks all for coming. Please visit our website, www.theamericanconservative.com, where we publish daily. Sign up for our email list, subscribe to the magazine, and join me in thanking Dr. Mitchell for this talk.